Etienne Balibar counts today among the philosophers involved in the revival of the philosophical reflection on the human being, the revival or the renewal of the philosophical reflection on the human being, or what we usually call philosophical anthropology. This designation has become problematic, perhaps even outdated, since the 20th century was deeply affected by the theoretical anti-humanism, which from Nietzsche to Deleuze via Heidegger, Lévi-Strauss, Althusser and Foucault announced sometimes the death of man, Nietzsche in Zarathustra, sometimes its dissolution, Lévi-Strauss in The Wild Thought, sometimes its erasure, like Foucault in The Order of Things. The starting point of a reflection, which, as that of Etienne Balibar, notes this disappearance of man, but nevertheless knows that despite it, we as human beings remain a pressing subject for ourselves, is to ask what form of thought will come within philosophy to replace the old anthropological discourse, and based on what principles this new form of thought should be exercised. This is why the problem of the human being explicitly marks Etienne Balibar's recent work, as indicated by the title of his book of 2011, The Citizen Subject and Other Essays in Philosophical Anthropology, and also by the title of his lecture at the Collège International de Philosophie on January 31st, 2013, Renewal of Philosophical Anthropology, this time with a question mark. I will appeal here to some of his formulations, which seem useful not only for an answer to the question, what can philosophy say nowadays about the human beings that we are, but useful also to grasp how the anthropological tradition in philosophy is transformed by this movement of revival or renewal, so that in the end, the name philosophical anthropology is not anymore the one which can describe with accuracy the type of reflection that we seek. I would like to expose the contribution of Etienne Balibar to an anthropology without metaphysics, and to what I call an anthropology without metaphysics. Hence, the first task to be performed will consist in explaining what is meant by this kind of reflection, which implies to show, on the one hand, what anthropology is referred to, and on the other hand, how far it is with or without metaphysics. Secondly, I will explore the contribution of Etienne Balibar, strictly speaking, which concerns particularly the method that he uses in his studies and the fantasies which he dismisses. Thirdly, I will return to anthropology without metaphysics, trying to advance it and to explain which new tasks it suggests. I will display the analysis in the framework of philosophy. Therefore, I will not deal primarily with empirical anthropology, but with speculative anthropology. Nonetheless, it happens to empirical anthropologists, those for whom ethnography and ethnology constitute an essential part of their research, and whose concern for the empirical and the field research is actually asserted against metaphysics, that is, against any speculation without concrete or material basis, to engage themselves in speculation and philosophy, as in the eloquent case of Lévi-Strauss, whom, in the preface to the Elementary Structures of Kinship, declares that, quote, scientific precision and exact observation are not necessarily incompatible with a frankly theoretical mode of thought and a bold philosophical taste, unquote. Etienne Balibar radicalizes even this relationship of Lévi-Strauss to philosophy when he says, in a dialogue of 2012 with the German philosopher Lydia Goehr, one of the founders of the Berlin School of Philosophical Anthropology, that, quote, the idea that Lévi-Strauss doesn't do philosophy is a perfect nonsense. Lévi-Strauss does philosophy from start to finish. He does philosophy in his presuppositions, in the way he sets up the founding categories of his research program, and he does philosophy constantly in his results and in the applications of these results that he suggests to issues of civilization, which are essentially ethical issues, unquote. So the question could arise whether even Lévi-Strauss falls into metaphysics, or if the importance he attaches to the field is a sufficient condition to protect him against jumping into the void. Anyway, when I mention an anthropology without metaphysics, I am not thinking of ethnology, but rather of an abstract work, one which, however, does not turn away from field researches and even takes them seriously. From then on, the question points. If the new anthropological project is speculative in the sense that its material consists above all of concepts and abstract reasoning, how can one separate it from metaphysics? Let us take a brief detour before we answer this question. Taking the word in its literal sense, speculation means reflexivity. In this case, philosophical reflexivity. And I will leave aside other more subtle differences between reflection and speculation, for example, as treated by Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit. At once, speculation or reflexivity reveal a dimension of the research which concerns philosophy itself, and therefore the conditions of possibility of the philosophical discourse. We then touch a critical principle, which is not far from the one formulated by Kant in the introduction to the transcendental dialectic of the critique of pure reason, when he warns the readers against what he calls, quote, transcendental use or misuse of categories, which is a mere mistake of the faculty of judgment when it is not properly checked by criticism, and thus not attend enough to the boundaries of the territory in which alone the pure understanding is allowed its play, unquote. The word that should be stressed in this sentence is the territory. The word that Kant uses is Boden. The territory which the thought should not leave if it does not want to fall back into the old metaphysics. With regard to this territory, Kant proposes to accomplish two tasks. Firstly, to expose its boundaries, and secondly, to exercise a disciplinary function to prevent these boundaries to be transgressed. Since the beginning of the critique, more exactly since the beginning of the preface to its first edition, he notes the human tendency to rise with, quote, principles whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience and at the same time sufficiently warranted by it, ever higher to more remote conditions, end quote, so remote that they become unreachable, an idea in which the power of thought is combined with the reference to its weaknesses. This is why the critique asserts its commitment to the Boden, a word which can indeed be translated as the territory, but which could also be translated as the ground, the one in which alone the pure understanding is allowed its play. This is an important issue for my approach, inasmuch as I feel concerned with the ground that philosophy should not live if it really wants to avoid the unfounded speculations. So from the point of view of the conditions of thinking, I would say that the metaphysical reflection is the one by which thought moves away from its lawful use, whereas the research without metaphysics is the one that remains attached to territory and to the terrestrial conditions. To better clarify this idea by using another text, let us take Marx's second thesis on Feuerbach, in which an opposition similar to that of Kant between the use and the misuse of thought is supposed. As we know, this thesis establishes the following thing, quote, the question whether objective truth can be attained by human thinking is not a question of theory, but a practical question. It is in practice that man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking. The dispute over the reality or unreality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question, end quote. Let me just add that I wrote this text firstly in French and then I translated it into English. And when I had to translate this quotation from Marx, it was really hard to to find the same echoes that I have found in a French translation. And it's very interesting to see the problem of the different translators into English, the problem to translate this word, this strange word that I read as this sideness. There are translators who write the worldliness. The word in German is dies Zeitigkeit. And then I start searching for other translations and commentaries on this translation in English, and I have found some references that I would like to add to give to you, and that I didn't find before because I didn't search for them while I was working in French. I was happy enough working between French and German and reading commentaries in English on this problem. I have found the following suggestions. As Cyril Smith notes in his book Karl Marx and the Future of Human, 2005, quote, the odd word Diesseitigkeit is chosen as the opposite of the much more common Jenseitigkeit, otherworldliness or transcendence. Unquote. Sorry?
L'au-delà.
L'au-delà. Oui, mais the problem is not l'au-delà, the problem is Diesseitigkeit. Richard Kilminster, on his book Praxis and Method, a sociological dialogue with Lukács, Gramsci, and the early Frankfurt School from 1979, explains that the word Diesseitigkeit, quote, means terrestriality, this worldliness, here and now-ness, end quote. Unquote. Other authors underline the connection between the second thesis on Feuerbach and Gramsci's prison notebooks, when Gramsci mentions the absolute earthliness of thought, terrestrità assoluta del pensiero. This is the case of Peter D. Thomas in The Gramscian Moment, Philosophy, Hegemony, and Marxism, 2009, in which the second thesis appears as a way to bring truth, as he writes it, down to earth. Further in the same book, Peter D. Thomas finds in the notion of an anti-metaphysical Diesseitigkeit of thought a vantage point for engaging with the widespread reference to different conceptions of immanence in contemporary radical thought. So I don't know exactly what to do with these several references, unless to say that they go in the same sense of my interpretation of the Diesseitigkeit as worldliness and immanence. It seems to me that the beginning of Kant's first critique and Marx's second thesis have precisely in common a certain respect due to the terrestrial or earthly exercise of thought, or a certain attachment to the territory in which alone thought is allowed to play its role. If this is the case, then one could say that just like Kant blames the transcendental abuse of categories and insists on the respect for the territory of thinking, Marx blames the scholasticism as an abuse of abstraction or a tendency to engage in a speculation which has lost all support of the practice. In other words, a speculation which went beyond this world and to the other side. Against this procedure, Marx's Diesseitigkeit, or terrestriality, as suggested by Richard Kilminster, or earthliness, following Gramsci and Peter D. Thomas, compels thought to keep its feet on the ground. From this perspective, and to a certain extent, the sense of what Marx perceives as scholasticism is not far from what Kant calls metaphysics, or, as we know, quote, the battlefield of endless controversies, end quote. Following this reasoning, I would like to use the word metaphysics not as a name for the studies that come after the physics, but rather for those which have left the fuses and claim to transcend it. If one agrees to understand the word metaphysics this way, one should be able to oppose to its movement something like a return to the ground. In other words, a return to the immanence, which is the condition under which there can be speculation, without metaphysics. This is how one could put forward a similarity between Kant, who proposed to check the faculty of judgment by keeping it inside its territory of legitimate action, and Marx, one who wanted to direct the research to the this-sidedness of praxis. I believe that Etienne Balibar shares this concern, which is also mine. Here is I believe, but I'm not sure. Here is a passage from his book, Violence and Civility, from 2010, that will help us understand how such concern is at work in his arguments. As you will see, these lines present furthermore the advantage of bringing us back to the anthropological issue, which was my starting point. He writes in the book, and I'm not sure whether the translation is precise, but well, I hope the translation of the book will soon be published in English. Anyway, we will get the main idea. So, violence and civility. Quote, "The modalities of extreme violence, of which one must propose doing a differential phenomenology, remain absolutely irreducible to a mere causality, as well as to one unitary anthropological ground, although they all raise the same speculative question, that of the constitutive presence of inhumanity at the heart of human, less as nature than as history, structure, and experience. To me, this prevents us from going back to the problem of the evil, either that we register it in the transcendence, either that we seek to embody it in historical figures, evil systems or subjects, and consequently of the good." Unquote. I'm sorry for the strange translation. My first remark on these lines aims at reminding Etienne Balibar's intellectual aversion to the big concepts, and all the more to their binary oppositions, in the present case the old dichotomy of good versus evil. Instead, he prefers to engage in a differential phenomenology of the modalities of violence. What does this mean? It means, once again, at least I suppose, it means that there are different forms and patterns of violence, among them extreme violence, which group concrete appearances and specific cases of violence. Given this diversity, the philosopher should address the specific distinctions within this field instead of contenting himself with generic designations. The various forms of extreme violence, for example, ultra-subjective and ultra-objective, as Etienne Balibar names them, appear, but also a whole series of modalities and degrees of abuse of force, the so-called physical violence, symbolic, structural, ordinary violence, and so on. These modalities relate themselves to one another and are even likely to strengthen one another as in a spiral, following a movement whereby the relationship between concrete forms of abuse of force becomes more complex. From an epistemological point of view, such complexification precludes the idea that one manifestation of violence would be the effect of a simple causality, and invites rather to an analysis in terms of a multiple causation, according to which every event is the effect of multiple causes, and it can in turn contribute with others to cause new effects that will follow. Thus, the differential study of the forms under which violence manifests itself refers to these multiple causes that make even more complicated to reduce the multiplicity of forms and models to a unitary evil motive. In turn, these causes are combinations of other causes, and this interwoven set converges on a specific effect of violence. In one stroke, not only the big concepts and their traditional dichotomous oppositions are suspended, but also the idea that a single event would, by itself, explain a violent phenomenon. This leads directly to a second remark. Following Etienne Balibar, there is not a specific source which would be common to all explosions of violence. This means that he dismisses the theme of evil, whether evil is defined in cosmic terms, political terms, or others. In any case, an evil that would still be easily identifiable on one side, opposed to which there would be another side also easily perceptible, that of the good. The abandonment of this idea of a source from which all evil would spring applies as well in case the source would be transcendent, devilish, strictly speaking, as in the case the source would be immanent to history, the embodiment of evil, of devil in an evil subject, say Hitler, Bin Laden, Ahmadinejad, or in an evil system, whether it is Nazism, terrorism, or, why not to say it, capitalism. Hence, this perspective is diametrically opposed to any moralization of politics, which tends to reduce politics to a field of confrontation between good people and bad people, with all possible variations of conceptual pairs, among them the revolutionaries against the reformers, or the axis of good against the axis of evil. But thirdly, differential phenomenology excludes another crucial element. Perhaps one would be tempted to say that despite the variety of forms and manifestations of violence, and despite not being able to make them all go back to the same cause, it would nevertheless be likely that they have one and the same seed, the human being. In this case, violence will have what is called an anthropological basis. It is the human that is violent. Yet, Etienne Balibar also rejects this form of reductionism. For him, there is neither an evil principle that would direct all the effects of violence, nor a human character that would be the condition of possibility of all violence. And it is exactly at this point that we return to anthropology. The philosophy of Etienne Balibar comes in the wake of the theoretical anti-humanism, which means that for him, the human being as a potentially comprehensible essence does not exist. Once this position is accepted, how does his method allow for an anthropological discourse within philosophy? It does it by the way in which it looks for concrete multiplicities of human beings and in human beings, instead of subsuming this multiplicity under generic anthropological categories, which would represent, in one way or another, an effort to retrieve man. Then comes into play a permanent principle of his method, consisting of always searching the critical reverse of the discourse, a concept, or an idea. As soon as one critical reverse is his expression, revers critique. As soon as one looks for a critical reverse, one gives up the captation of a nature, insofar as the nature, or the essence, should be able to be seized in a complete way. Applied to anthropology, this element of method leads to the idea that the human being is probably this, but also something else, perhaps even its opposite, or rather, the human being is its own internal differences and its limits. Furthermore, this is without reconciliation, inasmuch as reconciliation would harmonize the opposites, and therefore would restore a metaphysical whole. In these conditions, and by the reading of texts, one realizes that Etienne Balibar uses a quasi-dialectical method, almost dialectical, because it is never exercised as a way of overcoming the differences and the contradictions, but it's rather a way of taking into account of evolving tensions. The elements of these tensions, so to speak, enter into dialogue with each other, but do not dissolve in a unit that would embrace them and pacify them. So, the dialectical content that remains is merely associated with the idea that the elements have a dialogue, as when Etienne Balibar refers to the contradiction not as a problem waiting to be solved, but as a situation in which the content of a statement is opposed to another, or even the contents of several statements come into conflict with others. What remains then is a contradiction on the discourse level, where statements diverge between them, clash with each other, but also intertwine, in a word, play with each other. This principle is followed consistently, so that at the end of a writing, Etienne Balibar sometimes is not able to condense in an ambiguous formula the multiple aspects that he identified during the analysis. And accordingly, he can only display open configurations, avoiding any conclusion that would suggest that the debate would now be closed. I mention only one example of this. To sum up, let's say that differential phenomenology of violence is accompanied by the sidelining of three fantasies. On the firstly, Firstly, the unique cause of a violent effect. Secondly, the evil principle under the shape of devilish subjects or systems. And thirdly, the anthropological foundation of evil as rooted in human nature. This way, Etienne Balibar makes an obvious contribution in anthropology without metaphysics, which does not wish to leave the ground of multiplicities and differences to rise ever higher, as Kant puts it, to more remote conditions, or to what one could call the super-celestial place of big concepts and fixed oppositions. Now, this does not prevent the consideration of speculative problems, such as the one mentioned in the same quotation of violent sensibility, that of the inhuman at the heart of the human being. Okay, once again I have to leave some paragraphs aside. It is now time to return to our starting point, to the question about how we can distinguish the metaphysical anthropology from the anthropology without metaphysics. I would answer that the former means an investigation on the essence of human being, on what this being is, and an ambition which anthropology without metaphysics gives up. To better define each of these possibilities, I would briefly indicate some variants that we can find by Kant, but I won't have the time to do it either. So, okay, the conclusion will be the following. In contrast to the metaphysical path, which seeks being, or the essence, or the concept, under the question, what is the human being? Anthropology without metaphysics dismisses these determinations. It is curious to notice that it also finds some inspiration in a model for which Kant makes room. You know, Kant, the most famous question, what is the human being? This would be the metaphysical question, so the quest for essence or concept. But we can find another inspiration, another model. It is the model not of being, what is the human being, but of doing, which instead of wondering what is the human being, is interested on what, and now I quote anthropology from a pragmatical point of view, on what the human being as a free-acting being makes of himself, or can and should make of himself. This is the pragmatic path, which considers acting instead of being, and the action instead of the essence. It considers only contingent and provisional definitions of the human being, regardless of his concept. Probably these are enough reasons to give up the expression philosophical anthropology, which came to designate in the history of the last century a kind of research aiming to capture the human essence, for example, by striving to distinguish humans from animals or from the machines. This is why I prefer to talk about an anthropological philosophy. By inverting the terms, this designation is more able to mark the primacy of epistemological uncertainty with regard to human beings. Talking about anthropological philosophy, just like one talks about political philosophy, is a way of insisting on the philosophical openness instead of putting forward the human object with which it deals. In other words, rather than to search for the essence, cheap anthropological philosophy prefers the action, not what the human being is, but what he makes of himself. In this framework, the quest for universality and necessity is overridden by that of the particularities, singularities, and contingencies. Therefore, one cannot even ask, what does human being make of himself, just like Kant asks, and one should wonder instead, what do certain human beings make of themselves? Finally, anthropological philosophy disregards the preference given to what is timeless and infinite by preferring what is historically situated, therefore finite. The main question becomes then, what do some of us make of themselves and of others at certain moments of history and at specific places? If we want to give to this idea a more detailed formulation, we can say, what do we make of ourselves and of others to whom we relate at some point of our lives and at the place where we are? What have we made of ourselves and of others, with them, against ourselves? And what can we make of ourselves and of the others, with them, without them, against ourselves? These questions are not strange to those who in their private lives, as in public spaces, try to understand how they become what they believe they are, and strive to discover new ways of transforming themselves in the world. Anyway, I would like to suggest that they are better able to revive the philosophical thought on humans than are all metaphysical concerns. Thank you.
So I would like to open the questions again with a confession that I prefer dialectics to pragmatism, and if I may be so bold as to mention a German in this context, but I do it very quietly. I wanted, in the last talk, we were told that the subject-citizen relationship is not hyphenated to bring out this complex set of alternatives in relating the two terms, but I noticed that you put them together with a hyphen in your text, and maybe even in the title of the translation of the book. So I have a point in talking about hyphens. I was thinking the same about the term philosophical anthropology, that you suggested shifting the terms, turning them around to make a pragmatist term. But I don't think shifting the terms is going to do it. I think whichever comes first and whichever second, you need like subject-citizen to keep them playing against each other. And it reminded me of a book by a German, I believe, called Hans Blumenberg, who wrote Die Sorge gegen den Fluss, which has some Moses and theological connotations, and also Heidegger, but we won't mention him. But he has a long chapter on the relationship between Boden and Grund. And one aspect of Grund that you didn't mean is that it means reason. And so it's not merely territory and earth and bringing things down to earth, Aristotle and so on, but to play with what counts as a legitimate reason for something, which would be the philosophy, versus the ground, the Boden, on the basis of which we get to our anthropological side. And I thought that reintroduction of the notion of what counts as a legitimate reason complicates the relationship between Boden and Grund, and would give a nuance to your Kantian reading that you gave. That was my idea. Anyway, I think you need to be a little more dialectical between these terms and merely a pragmatist. Merely a pragmatist. I say this outside of merely a pragmatist.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Well, I definitely need, you're absolutely right, I definitely need to complicate the relationships between these terms. And I have deliberately kept aside the problem of Grund as reason. I mean, there's this important book by Heidegger, Der Satz von Grund. So the principle of reason, which is also the principle of foundation. And I mean, the word that I retain is Boden in the Kantian sense, trying to forget all the rest. Obviously, I cannot forget because my friends will remind me. Yes, of course.
Critique.
So I definitely take note of this chapter on Boden and Grund by Blumenberg. I will read it attentively in order to complicate the analysis. And let me just say that the word pragmatism is nowadays charged with several meanings and connotations. I'm using pragmatism only in the Kantian sense.
Okay.
I know that it's very hard to keep this argument like that because the word acquired another history, but I am just mentioning the difference between what he calls physiological anthropology and pragmatic anthropology, when he explains at the beginning of anthropology from a pragmatical point of view that there is physiological anthropology which is concerned with what nature makes a human being. And pragmatic anthropology is concerned with what human beings make of themselves. This is the only meaning I give to pragmatic. And so I try to set aside all the rest of the history of the world at the time.
Okay.
Yes, I apologize for intervening. Diogo, let me. I want to jump into the discussion on the Kantian meaning of graft. But first of all, I want to say that I don't hide myself. What I've been doing is an object, not the only object. It's an object of these discussions, and particularly your presentation. So I will not pretend that I'm not interested in how one understands my work. And I want to say that I completely I completely agree with the way in which you picture the kind of work that I do or that I try to do, especially on the question of violence and all that. I mean, your three fantasies, or that's absolutely, I'm perfectly happy with that. And then clearly we already had this discussion once, but it's evolving, of course, the question of whether it's interesting or important or even crucial to reverse the two terms and substitute philosophical anthropology with anthropological philosophy might appear as a mere scholastic question, play on words, etc., etc. But in fact, it does have a relationship to a strategic orientation. And it's fairly possible that we, on this respect, have different strategies, which this is not to say that I rule out your strategy, and I will not try to justify my strategy entirely. So let me get to the point. First of all, but that's the continuation of the same, considerations on whether to, on how to use metaphysics, metaphysical, etc., are of course not independent from the context to which we refer, and the most famous positions adopted in this respect. So you mentioned two of them. You mentioned Kant, and you mentioned Marx's second thesis with a beautiful philological and philosophical explanation. But of course there are others, and they're still there. So there's not only pragmatism, but most important of all is logical positivism and the Vienna Circle. So any Wittgenstein on the margins, I mean not so much on the margins, in the center, but as a sort of eccentric formulation. So any watchword of the kind, how to avoid metaphysics, how to avoid being falling into the traps, or going into the dangerous, fantastic world of metaphysics, is, like it or not, in a philosophical context, linked to also that context, which is extremely important. So it would be abusive on my side if I suggested that some of the sentences that you propose, or the judgments that you offer, have a kind of Vienna Circle or positivist resonance. This is not to dismiss them, but it's inevitably part of the discussion. Now, let's leave aside, return to the ground, return to, that's very interesting, and because when you return to, we return somewhere. So zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves, phenomenology in its initial version, or to the facts, Vienna Circle, etc., or to the world, this world, etc. So these are all similar ideas, and but not totally equivalent. And besides, there are different ways of returning. Returning may mean I had ventured. I was the child, the l'enfant prodigue. I mean, I had been venturing myself in the bad countries, etc. Let's come home and never run away again from it in the protected, so to speak, area, protected from the fantasies. Or it can be an iterative process. Let's always return to the fact. I must say that I would prefer that. And especially if you choose as your point of reference, so you won't be surprised, of course, not the Kantian, I will say something about it in a minute, not the positivist, but the Marxian way, and perhaps also Gramscian way. That is, we're not going to avoid speculation, because if we wanted to avoid speculation, we would not think, pure and simply. We would have no concepts. And even metaphysical concept. My epistemology, my historical epistemology on this point of view is not Kantian. It comes from Goehr and others. That is, you never do science, whether anthropology in Levi-Strauss's sense, or physics in Galileo's and Newton's sense, or any other, if not on metaphysical foundations and with metaphysical questions and notions. But you need to return them somewhere where they will be somehow tested and checked and transformed. And the crucial thing in that respect is not facts, empirical, it's conflict, in the sense in which you said it after Marx. So let's return these speculations where the place where they become conflictual, where they become actors in a conflict. And let's see what role they play in that conflict, in that contested territory. The Kampfplatz, of which Althusser spoke, that he took from Kant, but instead of wanting to avoid the Kampfplatz and protect oneself from the Kampf, which would be the catastrophic metaphysical thing. It would be the actual thing, the Sache selbst of thinking and combining politics with philosophy. Now, one last thing about Kant. What's interesting is the fact that Kant uses different metaphors all the time. You don't need to be a Derridian to understand that if you do not interpret the metaphors, you do not understand what is at stake. So you mentioned several of them, and of course the Boden is an important one, and you, etc. But the Boden, at some point in the Critique of Pure Reason, this is the end of the fourth section of the analytics of principles, becomes something else, which is I always found very fascinating. It becomes an island. It's become the island of the understanding. And then he proposes a fantastic, in fact, description of that island. He says, there's an island within which we can work with concepts linked to experience and the conditions of possibility. This is safe. But around that island is a sea which is full of storms and covered by clouds. So it's a sort of Nordic, it's Iceland, sort of Nordic island. So you should not be a Viking. I mean, you should not leave the island on a boat or boat people and venture yourself beyond the coast, because you'll find yourself lost in the middle of that metaphysical ocean, which at the same time is perilous and invisible, so to speak. And now, so there must be a police. You're absolutely right. But in your own interest, a police of thinking that says to you, stop there. And you know what comes to my mind? I mean, what comes to my mind is the exact the comparison between that police, the police of the understanding, that Kant attributes as a key function to the critique, and the police that today prevents boats, migrants, strangers, etc., from getting into the island, Lampedusa. The police is around. And if the boats coming from the sea and the cloudy oceans, etc., try to approach, well, sometimes they rescue them, but most of the time, essentially, they repel them. So this metaphor inevitably is ambivalent. And the function of the police is ambivalent. And I have to say that I cannot recognize myself already in the idea that, which I abusively attribute to you, that a non-metaphysical anthropology or philosophical anthropological philosophy would be like an island protected both ways by some sort of intellectual police, either preventing the diesseitige Leute, the people from inside, to venturing themselves into the unknown, and the speculative in that sense, or even worse, preventing dangerous fantasies, if you like, to return into the island, to remain on the safe burden of etc. This being said, I don't think that your final proposition, which I like very much, is purely Kantian, and you won't be. In fact, it's Foucauldian. It's Foucauldian because you substitute the Kantian formulation. What does man make of itself? With the formulation, what do we make of ourselves? And that's all the difference. In fact, it has a Kantian background, of course. Absolutely, I totally agree. It is a kind of pragmatism or post-pragmatism, but it's not the moral pragmatism that you find in Kant. I mean, it's much more uncertain.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So, I have taken note of all your remarks, so I will think about all this, and thank you so much. But let me just, it's really, I mean, there is something in common to your question and to your remarks and to what Lydia said. Since I am actually using, probably also misusing, some words that I strategically choose in Kant or in Marx. Or I'm not trying to give an interpretation of Kant and the Borden, Kant and the critic. I'm just seizing this metaphor to try to better explain what I mean. And what I mean is not at all that, and I wouldn't use the metaphor of the island, for example. I wouldn't use it.
Yes, but how will you avoid it?
Because I'm not making an interpretation of Kant. I'm using one passage of Kant to better say what I am trying to say. And the metaphor of the island makes me think of something quite different. Actually, Kant would never say, well, let me try to be Kantian for a moment. Kant would never say that you shouldn't receive people who want to come to this island. On the contrary, because if the island is a safe place, then everybody should come to the island to see the things as they should be seen, on one hand. And on the other hand, you should not leave the island only in which concerns the knowledge. But if you consider art or morals, then you are always leaving the island, in going to other universes of creation and invention and so on.
So let's break that Kantian distinction between the speculative or cognitive use of reason and the aesthetic or
Yes, absolutely. And this is exactly why the metaphor of the island cannot be useful for me. But your question is not, is it useful? Your question is, how can you get rid of that metaphor? That's another problem, actually. The same thing happens with the use that I do of the word metaphysics. I should better explain where the word comes from, just to give you an insight of what I mean. The first time when Kant asks the three questions, plus the fourth question, is on his lessons on metaphysics.
Logic. Lessons on logic.
Lessons on logic?
Mm-hmm. That's where it's published. You're right. It's.
Oh, I mean the Vorlesungen, not the book.
Okay, sorry.
This is the beginning of the 90s, 91, I think.
But that's the course on logic.
That's okay. I don't have to. Okay, we should. And let us suppose that it's on the lessons on metaphysics, and then I would suggest to consider this addition of the fourth question as the metaphysical jump. But okay, anyway, this is the meaning I give to the word metaphysics, and I only try to employ it within the anthropological problem, not metaphysics in general, but within the anthropological problem. But these are specifications that I have to do, obviously.
Schopenhauer replaces the island with a boat in the middle of the sea, on which live, or in which live the ship of fools. It's the ship of fools. So that's another long metaphor. Alan, you had a question?
Yes, well, or a statement or a response. I would like to connect the notion of the island, the boredom, the grown, to another notion, that of the field. I talk about field work in anthropology, in ethnography, and also to make the connection between the island and what Derrida has called the Robinsonian fantasies of sovereignty in an isolated, circumscribed space. And the reason I raise this is that the historical conditions of ethnological knowledge is violence, and is the colonial project, which is basically a project of relating citizenship to strangers and creating islands around which that relationality could be constructed and enforced. And there is no possibility of ethnographic or ethnological knowledge practiced by Levi-Strauss, or even to go back to Montaigne's essay on the cannibals, without the whole project of colonial pacification. And the fact that that project is not included or part of the meditation of philosophical anthropology, even whether it's metaphysical or post-metaphysical, is something we need to look at and to examine. My second point is your stress, Diogo, on the relationship, or the necessary relationship between violence and causality. I think that's extremely problematic. I think that the whole condition of possibility of that correlation is that somehow violence is a deviance from principial, foundational, grounded action. And that's why violence has to be measured against the metric of causality, usually deviant or abnormal or pathological or medicalizable causality. And I would argue that we have to begin thinking about violence as that which precipitates the whole problematic of causality, that precipitates its own causality. And I'm thinking of someone like Koselleck, who talks about political violence as the acceleration of historical time, as actually instituting new causalities, rather than subordinating violence to pre-existing metrics of the coercion.
Yes, I mean, about your first remark on ethnography, ethnology, and violence, I would have liked to address that point on the paper that I have announced, entitled "The Violence of Anthropology." So, and I didn't do it, but this is exactly one of my works in progress, so to speak. Maybe next time, if there is a next time. But that was exactly the theme, the violence of anthropology, in the two senses of that. About your second remark, I don't have an immediate answer, so I will have to think about that, the relationship between violence and causality. What I just wanted to say is that if we can think violence from a causal point of view, this can't be a simple causality. This is what I find in the text by Balibar, and I feel comfortable with this scheme, but I am not able to give a proper answer to your question, actually.
I wasn't commenting on Balibar's text, but usually in literature, the causal explanations of violence are teleocratic explanations. They're about teleology, they're about how to explain violence by ending violence, which is always a normative imposition, so you do not escape the moralization of violence through causal explanations. Actually you reproduce it. It's particularly contemporary, let's say political science, sociology, anthropology, it's very much an explanation parallel to a kind of medicalization. You have the symptom, you have the diagnosis, and then you prescribe a cure. And that is the ultimate moralization of violence.
That's everything that I wanted to echo.
Sure.